Up next, I have the honor of introducing one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Blockchain Caucus, Congressman Bill Foster. He represents the 11th District in Illinois, and he serves on both the Committee for Financial Services and Science, Space, and Technology. So please welcome Congressman Foster.
Good morning, everyone. For those of you who might not know much about me, I'm Congressman Bill Foster. I'm a scientist and businessman. In fact, I sometimes introduce myself as saying that I represent 100% of the strategic reserve of physicists in the United States Congress. And in this auditorium that we're in right now looks like a normal auditorium, but in fact, it is an auditorium that we routinely get very highly classified briefings in. It's very secure. When it's been swept and so on. And so I am able in this auditorium to inform you that for about the last 8 years, the federal government has been using quantum computing to reliably crack AES 256. Are you awake yet? Just kidding. But you know, it's anyway, and so I'm maybe the only member of Congress who's actually capable of understanding what it means to be quantum safe, potentially quantum safe encryption. And just a little bit more about me. My business, I went from the sort of the well-trodden path from theatrical stage lighting to high-energy particle physics to the U.S. Congress, so I'm just sort of another one of them. I had when I was 19, my little brother and I started a company in our basement, and that company now makes about 70% of all the theater lighting equipment in the U.S. So we're 90% of the lights on Broadway and 50% of touring rock and roll, about 70% of churches, schools, community theaters. But perhaps most significantly, back when I was about 25, I designed and programmed the control system for the Disneyland Main Street Electrical Parade. Which maybe some of you have been to or taken your kids. And so I ran the company for most of a decade and then went back to my first love, which was physics, and spent then 25 years as a high-energy particle physicist. I actually was on the team that discovered the top quark, the heaviest known form of matter, and designed and along the way did things like design 10 integrated circuits, every one of which has worked the first time, which is something I'm very proud of. And I don't want to overclaim, but I think I'm the only member of Congress who's designed and built a 100,000 ampere superconducting transmission line. I could be wrong about that. But I also serve on the Financial Services and the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. I'm actually the chair of an AI task force that's being set up in the Financial Services Committee to look at the tremendous implications of artificial intelligence, all across financial services, which will be transformative, not only to the future of work, which will hit financial services very hard, with technological job displacement, but also just the way we do business and understanding what the rules should be surrounding access to data and use of data in financial services. So I'm also, as was mentioned, one of the co-chairs of the Blockchain Caucus. And this is something, whenever there's a new technology, it's almost always a double-edged sword. An example of this, back in 2012, there was this incredible discovery called CRISPR-Cas9 that allows human genetic engineering, or genetic engineering generally. It's essentially a cut-and-paste technology for DNA. And so I, as at the time the only PhD scientist of any kind in the U.S. Congress, I served as a lightning rod, and I started getting these calls from cellular biologists saying, hey, there's been this breakthrough, and Brave New World is not 100 years away, and it's probably not even 10. It turned out it was 6 years away. And so when I realized that this wave of innovation, for good or ill, was coming at us, I realized it was very important that the public's first view of this be a positive one. Which is, I think, also true of blockchain technology. And so, for example, I have had my staff work very hard in advancing and raising the profile of using CRISPR-Cas9 to cure sickle cell anemia, which is a genetic disease for which we know exactly which base pair was swapped that causes this horrible disease. And now they're beginning to deploy this in a way that you simply remove the blood marrow from a patient, do genetic editing on it, put it and then transplant it back into the same person. So it will never be rejected. And this person, there are people walking around today that are 100% cured using this new technology. And if that is the first view of the public gets of this technology, then when things happen like actually did happen when some rogue scientist off in China used the same technology to change, genetically modify a baby, then at least there will not be uniform horror and a clamor to shut things down. And so it's sort of been a mixed rollout of blockchain technology, frankly. I know in my district, the first view of it, the first time it came on people's radar was when one of the small, not very sophisticated township governments in my district was victim to ransomware. And so that's not a very good rollout of this technology. But I think that there are tremendous use cases that, I know I'm working very hard to highlight. There are things that ought to be just clean wins, like having a non-falsifiable ledger for land transactions. This is something that just, it would, there's a wide range of political corruption and other kinds of corruption that result from land title fraud and from anonymous ownership of land, and things like blockchain can make a tremendous difference. Also supply chain verification. So issues like food contamination, luxury goods that are not counterfeits, intellectual property rights, conflict minerals. There's a long list of things that will be viewed very positively by the public, and it is part of what I'm trying to accomplish to make sure that that has more than co-equal billing as people become more aware of this. And another important use case is just to streamline the paper-laden and fragmented data systems we have. The things like health registry records, title registries, and the clearing and settlement of financial transactions. At the very heart of this is user authentication. This is something that the amount of human effort that goes into deduping databases to make sure that, this is the correct Bill Foster and not some other guy named Bill Foster. And so historically in the United States and in many countries, that has been a very politically fraught issue. The idea that the government would provide a secure means of having a person authenticate themselves, a citizen authenticate themselves as a citizen of that country. To many people, that sort of smells like a national ID card, and that has historically been very fraught. But on the other hand, the U.S. public, for sure, they understand that these big databases exist and they're going to exist no matter what. But on the other hand, they're just sick and tired of having to change out their credit cards every time someone steals their numbers and impersonates them online. And I think that the real life threat to people's privacy from having someone impersonate them online is actually much greater and much more real than nebulous worries about giant databases. And so we did an interesting experiment, actually, about a month ago now in the U.S. Congress. There has been a prohibition for the last 21 years on having an electronic health record system with a unique patient identifier that works across all electronic health record systems. This was an appropriations rider put on about 21 years ago by my former colleague Ron Paul, and which I won't comment on, but it is, this thing was killing and continues today to kill tens of thousands of Americans probably every year, simply from having incorrect or fragmented electronic health records, because there is no way to pull together the data in a mechanized, guaranteed to work way, to collect a single patient's health records from multiple sources. And, for example, there's a famous instance where a patient showed up at a hospital emergency room in cardiac arrest. They pulled down the incorrect healthcare record for the wrong patient, and that record had a do not resuscitate order on it. So they didn't resuscitate him. And that sort of thing, and then minor things happen. Smaller things like the whole business with doctor shopping for opioids. If you're familiar with that, that's when a patient who is marginally addicted goes and gets an opioid prescription from 8 different doctors. And without a uniform identifier, there is no way to test that. People are pretty aware of that, and they understand at this point that that part of the opioid crisis that has to do with doctor shopping would never have happened if this ban had not been there. Anyway, so I got a Republican partner, and we proposed eliminating this ban and got a very strong bipartisan vote for it. So I think the ground has sort of shifted there, because a lot of the times, a lot of the difficulties that happen in the blockchain world and the abuses that people worry about have to do with identity fraud. And so if members of citizens of the United States and other countries who wish to be provided with that are provided with a secure digital means of authenticating themselves online and the ability to selectively reveal the minimum amount of information for any transaction, I think that would be a tremendous step forward in preventing the sort of abuses that are frankly a danger to the blockchain community when you get identity fraud coming up. So stay tuned on that. And that's going to be one of the main focuses of the artificial intelligence task force that we're working on in financial services, because one of the things driving identity fraud are these very sophisticated, phishing scams and stuff like that, where people will listen to your voicemail response, use that audio sample to synthesize your voice, and then all of your friends will get a message that said, "Hey Joe, I just sent you an email. Can you look at this attachment and give me a call back?" And everybody clicks on that attachment because it seems like two-factor authentication. And so this is, because of these very high-quality AI-enabled threats to identity, I think that it's going to be one of the things that will drive the public further towards acceptance of a means to do that. So when you plan for the future, I think you should plan for a future that's already reality in countries like Estonia, Korea, and other countries, where there is a solid government-provided way of people authenticating themselves when they wish to do that. And I think that's going to be a real step forward for a lot of digitally enabled financial and other technologies. And then, this week, of course, we've had the Libra hearings, which you may have heard about and paid a little attention to. There was an interesting, wide dynamic range in the level of understanding among the members, at least on the Financial Services Committee, of the technology involved. And I just want to say it was probably not a trustless discussion. But this is, this is something that, if Facebook had not raised these issues, all of these issues would have come up. And I think for any crypto assets, there's sort of 2 major design choices that you have to face. And it was unclear, frankly, whether the Libra had really made these and articulated the 2 choices. The first question is it truly anonymous? Can you, or can you, for example, go to some trusted third party, a court that you trust, to go and figure out who is behind a transaction? This is, Brad Sherman gave a very impassioned speech on how he, and I think a good part of the American public, will view it as unacceptable if something happens like ransomware, like terrorism was what Brad mentioned, and in a way that you cannot, which has been enabled by, payment with cryptography. If there is not a way under that kind of circumstances to go to a court system you trust and look behind and see who actually owns it. So, you can design, crypto assets have been designed with or without that feature. But you should bear in mind the possibility that in many advanced economies, it's my political advice to you, I guess. I think it is likely that that's going to be a requirement in certainly a lot of the Western world for all this, and I guess it probably already is in China. So this is, that's one thing. The other question is whether or not transactions are reversible under conditions of where the transaction is mistaken or fraudulent. An example of this was when the guy died and marooned $100 million of Bitcoin recently. And what you'd really like to do, what I'd like to do if I was holding a lot of my net worth in that kind of entity, it would be good to be able to have a court that you trust that you can go to say, okay, here's the proof that this guy died. Here's a proof that I am who I am, and not some fraudster trying to grab the money. And having established that, have the court have access to a cryptographic backdoor to reverse the transaction where I put my money into that vault and give it back to me. Okay, now I've just said about 4 things that are just anathemas to the Bitcoin purist here. But there is a system, you know, but there are cryptographic ways to ensure that the court and only the court, in a publicly transparent way, can do those things, so that the courts can't just like steal your money from you without telling you that it has to be a transparent public interaction. And so my guess is that is probably where we're going to be heading for high-valued transactions in this country, that you're going to need a trusted third party. It will be not used 99.99% of the time. Most of the time, you're going to have, frictionless, very efficient transactions. But in that tail condition, the very small probability case where something is wrong or fraudulent, that you're actually going to need to have a court system that you can trust that will provide recourse. And so you should think through, what the implications of that are for the structure of the transactions that you're designing here. Because my guess is that for high-value transactions, that's going to be. It's also, I believe, a strategic advantage and a competitive advantage to countries like the United States, like Western Europe, which have court systems that can be trusted. All right, for example, would you like a lot of your net worth to be in something, in some crypto asset where the court of last resort was a Chinese court? All right, I personally wouldn't, and there are large numbers of countries that are probably in that same bin. And so I think that is a true competitive advantage for the free world and for democracies that maintain transparent and trustworthy court systems. So my suggestion is that you think about designing that in to high-valued transactions. Lower-valued transactions like supply chain integrity and so on can probably make do with just straight blockchain. And there'll be tremendous improvements there. Anyway, I just want to thank you for engaging with Congress on this. This is not going to be an easy discussion to have with Congress, and it's not helped by the fact that the number of people that really understand this technology, and the current Congress probably can be counted on 1 or 2 hands. And so this is it's another thing that I work on hard as a member of the blockchain, one of the leaders of the Blockchain Caucus. Anyway, thank you all, and I really was joking about quantum cryptography getting around AES 256. Thanks much.